Welcome back to the third episode of the Eminence podcast, where we discuss anything and everything. I'm your host, Will, and today I am joined by myself. Today's topic is the northeastern region of the United States, primarily located near the Great Lakes and often referred to as the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt became known for the steel and auto industry in the United States, reaching its height in the mid-20th century. This region of the United States helped fuel the country's war efforts by helping to produce much of the equipment used in the wars. Even though the region's reliance on the auto and steel industry led to its initial success in the 20th century, it would also prove to be its downfall. After World War II, both the auto and steel industries in the region began to dry up, leaving much of the Rust Belt without industry. At the same time, the American dream was in full swing. Once soldiers returned home from the Second World War, many people moved out of the cities and into the larger suburbs in a process known as suburbanism. The suburbs were more spread out, with larger homes, yards, and fresh air. But because of their proximity to the large cities, people tended to commute to those cities for work. The car made this possible by giving the average person a way to commute long distances every day. As more and more people got cars, more and more people moved out of the cities and into the suburbs. The people who could afford to leave, left, leaving the less well-off in the city. The population of many large cities in the Rust Belt began to tank. According to U.S. Census data, Chicago went from 3,620,962 people in 1950 down to 2,695,598 in 2010. Cincinnati went from 503,998 in 1950 down to 296,945 in 2010. And Detroit went from a massive 1,849,568 people in 1950 down to just a mere 713,777 in 2010. The mass decrease in population for these cities meant that these cities had less tax money coming in, making it difficult for these cities to combat the loss of people. Signs of deterioration of these cities can easily be noticed by people living in them. Most of my family lives in different cities throughout the Rust Belt, so I decided to ask them for examples of their cities deteriorating.
When I was about 10 years old, I would go down with my girlfriend. We would ride on the bus and wear white gloves and go all the way downtown Detroit, get off on Woodward Avenue and walk over a block by ourselves to take swimming lessons. You would not ever do anything like that again, particularly after the race riots had taken place.
Yeah, well, Cincinnati used to be a very thriving city, and it's not so much anymore. It used to be like one of the biggest Midwest cities. The river was a big transport area, and it's not so much anymore. It had a huge Cincinnati train terminal, not so much anymore. Downtown used to be thriving, not so much anymore. It's actually a pretty small city.
Yeah.
It used to be huge.
Because I grew up in Chicago and visited my family in both Detroit and Cincinnati several times a year, I always noticed parts of the cities that had obviously fallen on some harder times. Do you remember when we were driving in Cincinnati along the highway, and I asked you about the tunnels on the side of the highway?
Yes.
And you said that it was a metro, right?
Correct. So Cincinnati had developed a tunnels for a subway system underneath the highway, basically, that wrapped around the city. And then they discarded that because of the Great Depression, and therefore the tunnels are still there. They were never used for the subway, unfortunately.
I also took the time to ask my relatives if they have noticed any improvements in the condition over the years.
Oh, yes, I have. I think first of all, it used to be there would have not been very many people downtown shopping after the 1962 time, and it wasn't crowded downtown. Now you tend to see more people going back downtown and staying down there and shopping on weekends and after work. And it just seems much more vital. They have a winter festival where people come down and do all kinds of winter activities. and that draws a big crowd. So there's definitely a much better interest in being downtown now than there used to be during the early 1960s.
I did my own research as well on how to best go about improving the quality of the cities throughout the Rust Belt. During my research, I learned that John Austin, the former president of the Michigan State Board of Education, has been researching and evaluating what developmental strategies have been working in the region. Austin realized that the cities that were doing okay in the Rust Belt either were large, diversified metropolises and or college towns. We can see examples of this idea all over the Rust Belt in cities such as Chicago, Columbus, Champaign, Ann Arbor. The list keeps going. For most of my research, I focused on the very interesting case of Detroit. Detroit has probably had one of the hardest times in the Rust Belt, but the situation there seems to be improving. Part of Detroit's success can be lent to its position on the Detroit River, connecting it to the Great Lakes. Detroit's true success came with the invention and subsequent production of the car. As the automotive industry grew, so did the city. Detroit was so reliant on the automotive industry that it was given the nickname of the Motor City, or Motown. Eventually, most of the auto industry left Detroit behind. Detroit has also had a lot of issues with racial tension. In 1943, a race riot broke out in Detroit, lasting 2 days and killing 34. Sadly, this was not the end of race in Detroit. In 1967, another race riot broke out, this time lasting 5 days and killing a total of 43 people.
It was scary. We lived north of 8 Mile Road at about 10 Mile Road, and they had tanks ringed around 8 Mile Road to keep people from going in or out of Detroit. They had all the time were warning people where not to go, and showing pictures of buildings on fire and people looting, and even people that lived in the suburbs. It was very, very frightening because they were worried, of course, that it would escalate out to our area.
The combination of deindustrialization, racial tension, and suburbanism all assisted in the fall of Detroit. 6 years ago, on July 18th of 2013, the city of Detroit became a record breaker. Detroit had officially become the largest municipal bankruptcy filing in the history of the U.S. by debt. The Chapter 9 bankruptcy was estimated to have been between $18 billion on the low end and $20 billion on the higher end. Similarly to other cities found in the Rust Belt, Detroit's fall wasn't something that just occurred overnight. It was decades in the making. The city of Detroit was built to hold about 2 million people, but because of the loss of roughly 2/3 of the population, many homes and buildings fell out of use and were abandoned. One of the biggest changes that came around after the bankruptcy was the new addition of 36 planners, architects, urban designers, and landscape designers, all tasked with rebuilding the city. The first step Detroit undertook was demolition of the city's blighted areas in the hopes that someday some of the 70,000 abandoned buildings, 31,000 empty homes, and 90,000 vacant lots would be used and developed. The most important step of the revival process is the revival of the city's downtown. The importance of this step can be summed up in a quote by Dan Gilbert, the founder of the Detroit-based company Quicken Loans.
Without a city culture, an urban culture, you might as well be in the suburbs. It's the heartbeat of everything. Innovation, creativity is everything.
In downtown Detroit, a new streetcar line opened up, and the Detroit Pistons and Detroit Red Wings moved into the city's friendly Little Caesars Arena. Now most of Detroit's teams are located downtown and play within a few blocks from each other. With the teams now being downtown, there's much more to do in the heart of the city, which helps to make the city feel much more lively. For the most part, revitalization took place primarily downtown Detroit. But in recent years, more projects have been started in Detroit, not focusing on the downtown, but the city as a whole. Due to Detroit being built for 1 million more people than currently present, there is a lot of room for larger scale projects. The Detroit's Greenways Coalition has made an effort to transform the city with an addition of more parks, bike paths, and even forests. Because of Detroit's blight, many abandoned and blighted areas in Detroit are being converted to forests and parks. It's a win-win, because you get rid of the blight and the residents now have a park. Part of the struggle for Detroit was the bad reputation the city earned over the many years of decline and neglect. And the hopes of bringing back more tourism and, as a result, more money to Michigan, the Pure Michigan campaign was started in 2008. You might have heard Tim Allen, who grew up in the Detroit area, list off all the things that he believes makes Michigan great while you're on your way to work. These ads were fairly effective, even getting my mother, a Detroit native, to think of Detroit in a different, better light.
The first time I heard the Pure Michigan ads, they so perfectly captured all the wonderful areas of Michigan in ways that most people don't really get. And then when I heard the one that was focused on Detroit, it made it seem like a totally new, incredible place that who wouldn't want to visit. It sounded great.
Just like the Pure Michigan ads, Detroit's influence can be seen in many cities such as Chicago. The mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, picked Maurice Cox, the former development commissioner of Detroit, as her choice for Chicago's new planning and development commissioner. Detroit has become a great testbed for new ways of dealing with decreasing city. So it makes sense that we are starting to see some aspects of Detroit's recovery being copied by other cities who are facing similar issues. So there still is hope for the Rust Belt. But why should anyone care? Aside from being home to tens of millions of Americans, the area tends to be a point of contention during the elections because Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania have all historically been swing states. Although this region can be very important during the election, many Americans in the Rust Belt still feel forgotten and overlooked because even after 60 years of decline, their situations have not improved by much. The truth is that there isn't an easy way to revive the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is so vast and complicated that this is to be expected. If Detroit's recent success is any indication, things will eventually turn around for the better. It's gonna take some time, but through trial and error, I believe we will see the Rust Belt rise once more.